Okay, the last few shiurim we spoke about different Purim Katan, Purim Sheni's additions to the calendar, and I mentioned that a lot of the Yom holidays, all the Yoms in Israel, are very suspect to subject to the same shmuz, and one in particular was a very interesting machlekes amongst the Gedolim, and I want to talk about that one. Now, in 1942. I think in November 1942 is the first time that the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael officially became aware of the churban that was happening in Europe, of the tragedy that was in the middle of happening. And they had originally thought it was just rumors that people were being killed, but eventually the Yishuv started chapping that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions at that point of Jews were being taken to be killed wholesale. And they felt they had to have a response, they had to do something. And Rav Herzog, who was the chief rabbi since 1937, there was no state yet, but he was the chief rabbi for the under the British government. He made a Yom Tainus, a Yom Tefillah, where they published Kol Kairas all over the Middle East. It wasn't just in Eretz Yisrael; it was all over the Middle East. And they were geyser that the day I think was Chaf Daled Kislev, the day before Hanukkah, which was right after they found out Chaf Daled Kislev. They were geyser a Tainus for everyone in Yerushalayim and in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq. Whoever was part of that type of yishuv, and they made a tainus with full vayichal, with everything. They were going to have a kinnis, get together, daven. There's actually some famous pictures from that first tefillah that they made in the Churva Shul. There's a famous picture of the Imrei Emes sitting on the steps of the Aron Kodesh, like on the floor by the kinnis tefillah. So the Imrei Emes participated. A lot of the Gedolim Yerushalayim participated, and from there they moved on to the Kaisel. They did more tefillahs, and then it was a big day, a day of tainus, a day of crying out. Now, the Rav Herzog, upon completing this day of tainus that he made on Chavdal Kislev, nafalo such a rayon that l'chayr this Yom HaTainus should not be a one-time thing. This Yom HaTainus should be something that is at least every year or something like that, because to be maskir the terrible tzara. Now, the tzara is not mugbal to the day of Chavdal Kislev, but always when you choose a day that has some significance, like the day it started, or the day you found out, or the day it ended, you choose a day that has some sort of significance, and you bekaveh that day a tainus, l'dairis, so people could be maskir this terrible tragedy. Now, Rav Herzog, and this is a famous story, Rav Herzog went to the Brisker Rav to discuss this. And the Brisker Rav told him a fascinating psak, a psak from a source that's rarely used in psak. The Rav Herzog went to the Brisker Rav and he suggested that there should be a tainus for all coming dairis. To which the Brisker Rav told him as follows: that in the kinnis that we say on Tisha B'Av, there's a kinna. I think in our kinnis today, it's kinna Chavches or Chafei, where Rav Kleinimus of Rhines was masakin a kinnis after the Crusades in the 1100s. After thousands or maybe tens of thousands of Jews were killed during the Crusades, Rav Kleinimus made a kinna, and in the kinna he says as follows: he says, "Simuna levavchem mispad mar lekashra kishkula harigasam lesabu lesafar." This terrible tragedy that befell us is worthy of commemorating and making crying out about. Kisreifa space lekenu ha'ulam va'bira. It's comparable to the sreifa of the Beis Hamikdash, the ulam and the bira. But says the Mekainin over here, which is Rav Kleinimus, one of the Rishonim, v'chiein lahoisif mayid shever v'taveira. Lemaisa, we're not allowed to add a day of mayid, of shever v'taveira, of crying out for this brokenness that happened to us. Ve'ein lahaktim zulasi la'achra. And you can't push Tanesim earlier, you could only push them further. So Tachas Kein Hayem Levisi Eira. So because of that, today, I'm going to be Ma'ira on what happened to me then. So the Mekainin, who is Rav Kleinimus, one of the Rishonim, seems to be saying in this kinna that this sorrow that befell us of the Crusades was taka, it was something crazy, something that needs to be remembered, something that deserves to be remembered. But what could I do? To make a day for it, das kenach nicht. I'm not allowed to. To make it earlier, we don't push, which earlier meaning because the tzara of the Crusades happened earlier in the calendar, it happened during between Pesach and Atzeres, but that time, you can't go earlier. So what am I going to do? Yom Kippur on Tisha B'Av, I'm going to have to be maskir on Tisha B'Av. That's what the Mekainin says. So said the Brisker Rav to Rav Herzog, that you see from the Mekainin over here, from the Nusach of the Kinna, that being Moisif a Yom Tainus is not something you could do. He says, you can't be Moisif. So what I have to do it on Tisha B'Av. That's what the Mekainin says. Now this is a fascinating makar to bring a psak from. I don't know, to my knowledge, maybe people know otherwise, to my knowledge, I don't think there's any other psakim that come from the Nusach of the Kinnis. Nusach of Kinnis that Rishonim wrote along the way. The Brisker Rav is making a psak based on this Nusach of the Kinnis, that you can't be Moisif any fast days, and therefore you can't have a fast day that's going to go on, the Deiris. Now, this position of the Brisker Rav ultimately is not just the position of the Brisker Rav, it's a position of many, many Gedalim. But, not, Ulai Lav Mitaimei, meaning not exactly in the Nusach of the Brisker Rav, but it spawned a fascinating conversation about calendar additions, which is what we've been discussing, adding different mayadim and different tanesim onto the calendar. So now the shmooze that started was a little bit later, in 1945, as the war was coming to completion. The war was almost done. The agudas, the mayatzis of the Agudas Yisrael got together to don the same shaila, to be kaveya tainis, ladeiris, that Klal Yisrael should adhere to. And Rav Chizkiyo Yosef Mishkovsky, who's the Rashiva of Kfar Hasidim, I believe, he wrote a letter to Rav Herzog in 1945 summarizing what took place at the meeting of the Gedalim, the Agudas Yisrael's mayatzis, and trying to get Rav Herzog to sign on to it as well. So he writes as follows. He says, we got together, we got together to be ma'ir rachamim on the remnants of Klal Yisrael that's still caught up in the clutches of the mashchis. And Shem Yisrael, Shem Yisrael, She'ez Yisrael, V'yem el-mashchas heref, okay, we daven and should be over. And then he says as follows. This was the hatzah that we had. Hakinis machraz al yom tzoyim kavua l'deiris. The kinis is going to be machraz on a fast day kavua l'deiris. Im b'yom hatzayim shel ha'evel. Oy b'yom acher. Either a day, this day or another day, he says, Shabbonis Rabba Hatzara, a day, we could choose a day when the tzara got, very enlarged. Shel l'tzoyim zeh yehi chaymer Tisha B'Av, it should have the chaymer of Tisha B'Av. And this should be a takana l'deiris. And this is something that Mishkovsky, together with the Vizhnitzer Rebbe, the Sadigari Rebbe, they wrote this letter to Rav Herzog, asking Rav Herzog to sign on to this Hatzah as well, which we already know was not something that Rav Herzog was against from his previous attempts in 1942. Now, Rav Herzog has a tshuva about this. In his Sefer, in Heichel Yitzchak and Arachayim, he has a response to Rav Chizkiyo Yosef Mishkovsky. And first he starts with the nuts and bolts of it, about Taisif. Are we allowed to be Moisef and not to be Moisef? Machik Rishaynims, little the nuts and bolts of it. Then he has a few fascinating tidbits in this conversation over here, and I'll read you some of them. He says, first he brings, he says as follows this. Chutz mizeh, he says, after he handles the Baal Taisif element, and this is where it gets a little sticky for the Brisker Rav's psak from the Kenner. He says, Chutz mizeh, Hari yesh lanu ma'aser Rav. We have precedent. This is not the first time in history that there was need to add a tainus, and that a tainus was added. He says, Hari yesh lanu ma'aser Rav, Chaf Sivan, the day of Chaf Sivan, shegazru v'ad arba ratzis. It's the day that the v'ad arba ratzis was gozer lehisanis by to fast in it. V'kvar b'yimei masis hatslav, already earlier during the Crusades, nik v'zel yem tainus el shenishtakcha. So now what he's bringing is a Messiah as follows. There is a Messiah that says that after the Crusades, at exactly the same tkufa that this kinna was written, that the Brisker Rav was relying on, Rabbeinu Ephraim of Ban, who was one of the Balei HaTosfos, made a gzeira to have a tainus on Chaf Sivan. The day Chaf Sivan was the day that the Crusades kicked off in earnest, and grace of thousands, high numbers of Jews were killed, whatever the number would be, and he was gozer that on Chaf Sivan, it should be Yom Tainus. Now, Rabbi Ephraim of Ban's Gzeres Tainus seemingly dissipated and fell away over the next bunch of centuries, which is not unreasonable over time. Even something that was mamish, very heartfelt and meant a lot to the Yadus of Germany and France and whatever. Over time, over tens of dairis, it will fall apart. Now, came along the Kazakhs in 1648 and 1649 in Tachvatat, and they did to Klal Yisrael what was again unprecedented to Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael never experienced such an assault from their neighbors. And again, Klal Yisrael got together, the Vada Baratzis, and this includes some serious heavy hitters. The Vada Baratzis at that time was led by the Taz, who was the Gad Ladar. The Taz was an old man, Taz was Gad Ladar. But the Shach and the Taisus Yamtif and others, other great luminaries also participated in the Kviyas of Chaf Sivan as a Yom Tainus for Klal Yisrael. So says of Herzog, we have a Ma'aser Rav. We know that this exists already. On the calendar, in the Jewish calendar, granted it's not something that's observed right now, he says, He says, this was a Gzeira of Tainus in all of the kingdom of Poland. He says, fine. Then he brings something more, and he says as follows. So he brings, different rate about Taisif, and he sticks with this. He thinks that there's good precedent, and this is something that should be done. Now, there are two tidbits in this tshuva that I think are very, very fascinating, worth sharing. At the end of the tshuva, he brings as follows. Someone, he doesn't say who this is, had a taina against me, and he said as follows. He says, Adayin le'nigmar ha-muchama. It's in 1945, it's the end of the war. The war is still not over, he says. Adayin le'nigmar ha-muchama. I actually think it's still 1944. I think this is 1944, the end of 1944. He says, Adayin le'nigmar ha-muchama. Umiya ideya Efshar shemasha avar aleinu ul chavli Mashiach. Maybe what's happening to us is chavli Mashiach. Maybe this is chavli Mashiach. And who knows where this ends? Meaning, why are we jumping in and making a tainus l'deiris now, before the war is even completed? He says, V'alkein, yesh lanu lidchos ha'hachlata ad la'achrei ha'milchama. We should wait to make this final decision until the war is done, he says. Nimug zeh yesh b'benois tam v'roi l'tshumas leiv. He likes this ha'ara that someone sent him. He likes this ha'ara someone sent him, and maybe it's not the time yet to do it. Now, he leaves off, taka like with this Nemo, that we have to wait till the end of the war. In the bottom over here, he brings a footnote, and clearly this was added in later on. This is not something that was written when the Tshuva was written. He says, Aruni Gamkein, they were ma'ir, and he heard this from this Rav himself, so I don't know who was ma'ir, but Aruni Gamkein, Al Hanemar Bekina Miyit in Reshimayim, which is the kinna that we just read from, that the Brisker Rav was quoting, Bekesher Masas Hatzlav, which is referring to the Crusades, and it says, Simuna Levavchem Mispad Mar Lekshera, Kishkula Harigas Lasabla Lasatva, Kseris for the kinna, but V'chiein Lahaisif Mayid Shev V'Tavera. We're not allowed to add a day to the kinnis. So he says, what is this? How does this stem with what I'm talking about? And he comes up with like a creative way to read the kinna, which is not the basic way. He says, maybe what the kinna means, he says, he says the suggestion that they were discussing, that the Mekainen was suggesting, was discussing, was to add kinnis to Shavuos. And that the Mekainen said not to do, which is I think according to all accounts, a very forced reading of the Kinnah. L'chayra, it's not, meaning, that's not what the Kinnah is saying, Api Pashtus. It's a forced reading of the Kinnah. Granted, there's a taina on the Brisker Rav that, the Paskin from a Kinnah, who even said the Bala Kinnah held like that, Halach al-Maisa, and even if he did, maybe we Paskin like Rabbeinu Ephraim, and the Taz and the Shach Paskin like Rabbeinu Ephraim. I mean, there's a lot of other tainas you could say on the Brisker Rav Paskining from this Kinnah. But his alternate reading of the Kinnah is not the strongest, taina on the Brisker Rav. Now, incidentally, he's not the only one who learned this kind of differently. The Chassam Sofer in Shuvan Archaim, when he's handling about bris getting a haircut during Sfira, the Chassam Sofer references that this is a very Ashkenazi holiday, meaning this. Let me get that right. The idea of being sad during Sfira is a very Ashkenazi holiday, which makes sense. It's a Litvish holiday to be sad, Chassam Sofer says, and he quotes this kinna as a makar for it and whatever, but he learns the kinna also differently than how the Brisker Rav is learning it. So Rav Herzog is not the only one who learns the word of this kind of differently, but granted, not in the same way as the Brisker Rav. So now, really what we're left with over here is the Brisker Rav expressed a hashkafa, that there's not supposed to be a new Yom Tov added to the calendar. We spoke from the Merav Shakar and the Chida and others, but he's talking about Tanesim. Brisker Rav seems to be saying from this kinna, we don't add new Tanesim to the calendar. So, the kasha is, and we'll ask it very straightforward, we do. Meaning, Chaf Sivan is an addition to the calendar, that was added side during the Tkufa of the Bali Ataisis and side during the Tkufa of the Vad Arba Rotzis with the Taz and the Shach and etc. Seemingly we do add to the calendar. So what's this hisnagdus that the Brisker Rav is expressing? And fine. So there's a few technical terutzim I'll just run through. And then there's probably the true idea of what the Brisker Rav was saying, even though he wasn't saying, and that's more expressed in the words of the Chazon Ish. So firstly, Reb Moshe in Igros Moshe has a tshuva about Yom HaShoah. And Reb Moshe says as follows. Reb Moshe also agrees with the Brisker Rav and says not to make it, and he quotes the kinna. Reb Moshe, interestingly enough, Paskins like the Brisker Rav, mitamei. He quotes the kinna that the Brisker Rav quotes, and says we don't add this to the calendar. And then he asks, he says, he asks the kasha himself. He says, V'leidami l'gzeri l'shnas hei alaf m'tach v'tat, alidei Chamel Yinitzki Rasha Kazakin, shenergubu Ukraina v'chelik mipoilin. He says, and don't ask me from what happened in Ukraine and Poland with Chamel Yinitzki and the Shekavu Sham Yom Tainis V'amir Slichas La'asrim B'Sivan. That over there you see precedent that they were Keveya Tainis. Is Mishum Shalei Hoysezu Gzeira Klalis K'Gzeiris Hagalas V'Achorban. He says what happened to the Jews in Poland and Lithuania was not Gzeira Klalis like the Chorban. Elohi Rak B'Chelik Medina Achas. It was isolated to one small area where it affected the Jews. Shoyis Gzeira Neisefas Al Oysen HaMukaimis. V'gam Gzeirizu the Shnas Tach V'Tat Le'Hoy. And so says Ramesh Chelik number one, it happened to a group. It didn't happen to everybody. As opposed to the Chorban happened to everybody. So when something happens to individuals are allowed to be meisif what they want. Like we saw earlier last week, and the week before such a chilik, individuals could be meisif what they want. But to nem zechab for the gans Klal Yisrael, that you don't have the ability to do. That's chilik number one, he says. Chilik number two, says Ramosha, and this is a fascinating chilik, he says, Lehois alidei malchus, the gzeir of tach v'tat was not done by a kingdom. Chorban is about, Golos and Chorban, says Ramosha, is about being subjugated under the powers that be, under the governments that be, having no civil liberties and the governments that subjugate you. It says the fact that a couple of Tzalasta hooligans could come and inflict damage or pain on the Kehilas of Klal Yisrael, okay, no, that happens, he says. That's not the gzeira of galus. That may be a gzeira for a different thing, maybe an einish for something, a different gzeira. That's not galus. Galus means being subjugated under the government, he says. And that's not shayach over there. So he says, male over there, they were able to make a tefillah, but things that are just a hemshech of the gzeiras hagalus, i.e. being subjugated under a government, that's a chelik of the chorban. That goes back to Tisha B'Av. That's galus. That's regular galus and chorban. That you don't make a yom tov for. That's Ramesh's two technical chilukim. Now, I'll leave it up to you. Everyone could have their own opinion where the Nazis fit into that. Are the Nazis, are the Nazis government? Are the Nazis just something that went rampant? Meaning, because the Nazis, in a certain sense, are anti-government, right? They're fighting every government, and governments had to arise to fight them. In a certain sense, they were a government, but they didn't have the shlita of all the Jews that they killed. They chased them down and killed them. So it was just, you draw your own conclusions. Ramesha is seemingly agreeing with Briskerov that the Nazis would fit more into the idea of galus of the Beis HaMikdash, meaning it's government subjugation, it's government persecution. Government persecution just is continued. We look at it as a continuation of the Churban, like the Mekainen says, like Rav Kleinemer says, and we don't make a mascaras for that. Now, a second nakuda worth shtelling zachap on is very interesting that the kinnis that were written to say on Chaf Sivan, on this tainus of Chaf Sivan, several kinnis were written to say, and they are written by the Shach, for example, has a sefer called Megillas Eifa, a little different than Tais Yom Tov. That was Megillas Eiva. This is Megillas Eifa, where he writes about the story that happened. His focus is on Nemirov and Lita and what happened during Tachvatat. And at the end, he signs off that I'm being kaveya li ule banai ule deiroisai at seif kol adeiris to make a tainus on Chaf Sivan Tak, he says. Which, okay, but the Shach is saying it personal, meaning the Shach was a very young man. The Shach was not the God Ladar. The Shach was a young man. He's writing personal that I'm accepting the gzeira of the tzibra of the Vadar Baratis on myself and my family. And then he writes a kinna. Now, one of the main kinnis that people said during Chaf Sivan for Deiris afterwards was the kinna of the Taisus Yom Tov. Seemingly, the Taisus Yom Tov was an expert kinna writer. He wrote a kinna for Prague, for their personal, tzara. He wrote a kinna for his own family, for his personal tzara. And when the Vadar Baratzis was seeking out like the proper scribe to write a kinna for Gans Klal Yisrael, they sought out the Taisus Yom Tov and they asked the Taisus Yom Tov to write it. Now, when Taisus Yom Tov wrote the kinna, he legged to a haktama that he requested should be published every time the kinna is published. I think over time that dissipated and that didn't happen. The Hakdama was not published every time the Kinna was published. But Taisus Yom Tov requested that the Hakdama should be published. And in the Hakdama, Taisus Yom Tov writes as follows. He says, he's writing about, he says as follows. He says, Loikein hayu hatzara she'avru aleinu mimoisa chorban. B'kulam hoisa hatzara mitzad sinna she'hoisa aleinu me'oisim asher bikshu nafshenu lincoln bonu nikmas harag v'cherev. He says, generally, tzaras that befell Klal Yisrael were tzaras because of the sinna that the Goyim had for us, he says. Then he makes an exception for what happened in Prague. But he says, Ach, zeh ha'maisa shel achshav, the story now of Tachvatat, hoye k'may ha'gzeres asher hoye me'olam. This was like all the gzeres that were me'olam. V'chol ma she'heru laviseinu akadmoinim, heru lebanim. Whatever bad happened to our forefathers, meaning by the Churban, happened to us again by Tachvatat. V'aleim kvar kadmoinim chibru b'em slichas, v'sipru b'em mo'iris. And on such type of things that befall us, the earlier Deiris already wrote kinnis for them. Achasi, Al-Kain Amarti says, I'm going to go look at all the rest of the kinnis from Tisha B'Av and look at the rest of the kinnis, Vayikainin Yirmiyo, Vayikainin, all the kinnis that Klal Yisrael has, and I'm going to try to mold my kinner now to be mamash a copy of the kinnis from then, he says. Because Gufa, a person has to understand that all the tzaras that befall him is a continuation. So the Taisus Yom Tov, when he's writing the kinna, almost like incorporates the Briskerov's critique into his kinna. He writes, Vada. This is something at Tzara that's a continuation of the Churban. Everyone has to understand that. And Mela, I'm going to go seek out the kinnis that were written about the Churban to frame this Tzara in exactly the language of the Churban. I'm not going to trivialize this by making it like its own thing, its own language, I'm going to frame it in exactly the language of the Churban because that's what it's part of. So the Taisus Yom Tov and the Vadar Baratzis are using the Briskerov's rationale, meaning they're very partial to the Briskerov's taina, that all tzara and chorban is a continuation of the chorban and does not deserve, and it shouldn't be mentioned on its own and shouldn't be added, but not so purely in the technical sense, like that you can't add on a tainus. Of course you can add on a tainus, provided that you frame the tainus in the proper framework, that it's a continuation, you could add on a tainus. That's what the Taisus Yom Tov is doing. Now, the Chazon Ish has in his own way a very thorough zugang to why we don't do it over here, and maybe from him you get a little bit what the problem was. The Chazon Ish writes as follows. He says, In Yanei Halacha, the Chazon Ish is like very short but very complete. Chazon Ish says as follows. In Yanei Halacha, he says, Kfuim al pi ha-Torah. She'ikron b'ksav v'perushim b'Torah sheba'al peh. V'af navi ein rashai l'chadish at shematzu lem smach b'Torah. Even a navi can't be mechadish something until he finds a smach b'Torah. U'kashem she'agarin b'chlal neliza me'ha-Torah, kacha yisaf al mitzvahs ha-Torah neliza me'ha-Torah. He says, just like the kernel, the shirish of everything stems from the Torah, any yisaf has to come from the Torah. He says, b'yisoid zeh, whether to make a tainus, to be kaveh an extra day, and not tzarech she'elas chacham. He says as follows, and this is very, very chazonishtik, he says, Im chayavim, if you're mechuyev to be moisev a tainus, ein tzarech haskama. You don't need anybody's haskama. Then pturim, harei kfaron umuzharim, linig b'ptur zem b'nei shatar patrasan. And if you pater from it, then there's no reason to be moisev. You don't gain anything. Like there's no good feelings by being moisev something you're not mechuyev to do, he says. Ulishmaya mizevach toiv. To listen to the Torah is even better than being moisef, your derenis, your karbanas, your extra, your additional zachin. V'hatzah, he says, hikanas l'kvayev alasis ligzer l'kayim, hika kolas roish chas v'shalom b'yisay the halacha. This is very sharp. Says the Chazon Ish, the idea to gather together and to make some sort of shutvis, to make some sort of yoim, is like being mekel roish chas v'shalom b'yisay the halacha. V'roy l'hasira me'al aperik b'tarim hu also. It should be taken off the agenda before it's even raised. It says, kach kviyas tainis l'deris, who b'chlal mitzvah derabanan. Kviyas tainis l'deris is b'chlal mitzvah derabanan. He says, "Mashi yesh b'yadenu izman shehois adayin nevuah." The tainesim that we have on the calendar are from when there was still nevuah in Klal Yisrael. Ve'ech noyis panenu dar shetayv lehashtika. What are we going to do with dar? It's best for us to be silent. Lahara kazois l'kvaya dvarim l'deris. Who are we, the small dar, who it's best for us to be silent, to be kaveya things for the future for deri deris? Ve'atzah azois me'ida aleinu, and this is the Chazon, and he ends off. So the Chazon Ish seems to say it's a dar problem. Meaning, Chazon Ish is not arguing on the premise that it exists being Moshe Tanesim. Chazon Ish is aware that Tanesim could be added to the calendar. He's not arguing the premise. Chazon Ish is just saying, what is it for a dar like ours to come and be Moshe for Tainus? We can't do such a thing. Now, incidentally, in Pe'er Adar from the Chazon Ish, there's even more to the story. When the Chazon Ish heard that this was going on, the Chazon Ish was afraid that the Imrei Emes, who I mentioned earlier, had gone to Rav Herzog's original Tainus, was going to be partial to this Kviyas Tainus. And he knew that Rav Herzog and the Remembrance were close, and he was afraid that Rav Herzog was going to get the Remembrance on his side. So Chazon Ish sent the Shliach, Rabbi Yamin Mendelssohn, who was later, I think either then already or later, the Rav of Komamiut, was a Gerach Chassid, but was a Chazon Ishnik, and he sent him to the Imrei Emes to discuss it. And he came into the Imrei Emes, and he told the Imrei Emes, the Chazon Ish holds X, Y, and Z about being Kaveya this Tainus, that it's not the proper dar. And the Imrei Emes told him in one-liner, the Imrei Emes said, in my entire life, I was never Kaveya anything for Deri Deris. I never saw that as my job. I'm a for this dar type of person. You have nothing to worry about. I never saw it as my job to be kaveh things like Deri Deris, the Imrei told him. The Chazon Ish was happy. Now, in Pe'er Adar, they bring down several other stories that from people discussing the Hatzah with the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish said something that is fascinating. I don't think you'll see anybody else say this. Chazon Ish said, first of all, a few things. Chazon Ish said that Taz, even though it's mizak there, but that the Taz was the geyser, because the Taz was in charge of the Vada Beiratzis, Taz didn't write it in any of his Svarim, he says. So, L'chayra, the Taz also wanted it to be forgotten over the Deiris. The Taz never wanted that it should be the Deri Deiris Mamish. The Taz felt, in the dar that he was living, for the time that he was living, yeah, you had to have some sort of mascaras for the Tainus. And he made a mascaras, they made Chav Sivan with kinnis and everything. But the Taz was totally on board with over the Deiris of being forgotten. He says, Mashenkin over here, where you're going to have the apparatus of a state, you're going to have the government who makes, legal holidays, and like we'll see in a second, like Taka happened, that's a Deri Deiris thing. That's not something that falls off. That's, government, that's laws, that becomes laws. Laws we're not okay with. Now, incidentally, they asked the Chazon Ish, someone else asked the Chazon Ish, how come we don't make this? And the Chazon Ish says, why should we, a small dar, make zeris for daris that are going to be bigger than us? Which is a fascinating thing. You come out, don't hear people talk like that. The Derech Klal, we always say, Niskat no adaris, Rishanim kechamar, kibnei adam, anu kechamarim, all these type of talk. The Chazon Ish held, on a certain level, that Klal Yisrael was going to have better days, ki'ilu. And you could talk to anybody who knows a little bit the history of Torah and Lita and Europe and wherever, and I can't tell you in Eichos, but certainly in Kamos, Klal Yisrael's attachment to the Torah and Elam Yeshivas and Kailul and etc. grew to numbers that were, Pasha couldn't be dreamt of, unheard of things after Zion Eretz Yisrael and Zion America. So the Chazon Ish, in his own way, seemed to have been predicting somewhat that the Torah was going to have such a significant rebound that it doesn't pass for us, his dar, the dar of the Chazon Ish, which is, a dar de'ek, haviyachol of Gedalim, to make Xer for future days. This is what Chazon Ish told several people that makes it into the Mascaras. And now, ultimately, what ends up happening is they make a Yom Tif, right? A Yom HaZikaron, and it becomes a very interesting Yom Tif. Yom HaShoah in Eretz Yisrael is called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. Now, why is it called Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura? It's because there was a big fight in the Knesset in the 1950s when they wanted to pass this day to make a holiday. So there was a big wing of the Knesset, a camp of the Knesset that said, why celebrate the Jews who went Katzain L'Tevach and were just wiped out by Hitler, the losers, who wiped out Katzain L'Tevach, that's who you're going to make a celebration for. Celebrate the Giborei Yisrael who got together on, in the Warsaw Ghetto and fought back. Now, granted, that's a shmuz for itself. We should do that one time. The halacha application, the meaning, is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising permitted la halacha? We should talk about that actually, but celebrate them. Now, the problem is that the day that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising started was Yud Daled Nisan, which is Erev Pesach. Now, the halacha in Siman Taf Chof Tas and Shulchan Aruch is that we don't fast. Erev Pesach is a Yom Tif. We're not allowed to fast. You're not allowed to do anything. So how do you make a Yom HaZikaron, which is a fast day, ostensibly? I grant, even though that's not really how it shook out in the end, but ostensibly it's a sad day. How do you make that during Pesach? So they thought maybe to make it on Chav Sivan. Make it when everyone makes it. Chav Sivan. Actually, that day already, it already tried a bunch of times. There was a hatzah to make it on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is, to Beis HaMikdash stick. It's going to get swallowed up by the Beis HaMikdash. So in this tug of war of how to make it, it ended up being on Chav Zayin Nisan, so that it could Ki'ilu incorporate both things. It's close enough to the season of mourning, traditional mourning season in Yiddishkeit, and it's close enough to Yudalad Nisan, which is the Yom HaGvura. And it became Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura together. Like it celebrates the things together. So now, L'maisa, it's Shalei Halacha, meaning Minei Obey, because the Shulchan Aruch is in Taf Tes, the Mechaber, the Ramah says Lahedya, the entire month of Nisan is not allowed for anything, and as I paskintman, we don't say Tachnun, it's a month, it's an off month. You don't do sad things during the Man Nisan. Now, Grada, most of Yom HaZikaron became flags at half-mast and a moment of silence and other things that are be'etzem nothing in Yiddishkeit, meaning things that don't have any makar in Yiddishkeit, so they're not even really a violation of the, meaning the violation is to fast, to say kinnis, to make a yom tzara, to stam do a moment of silence is kind of nishtei. It's nothing. It doesn't really violate anything. Yeah, it doesn't really violate anything. But Al Kapanim, the Brisker Rav and the Chazon Ish, in their vision of what a Yom HaShoah and being nikva, meaning would be, realize that it's just ki'ilu, let's say this right, it's just ki'ilu weaponizing the machinery of Yiddishkeit, but gutting out the soul of Yiddishkeit. Meaning the Tosfos Yom Tov preference is that avada you could make a Yom Tainus to be maskir tzara, but it has to be in perspective. You have to understand where it comes from, what it represents, and you put it into the proper context, then of course you could make one. But to weaponize like the machinery of Yiddishkeit, that there exists such a thing as a Yom Tainus, but to gut out all the kishkes of it, meaning it has nothing to do with what a Yom Tainus is about and what a Yom Chorban is about, that is what these Gedolim were protesting against. And each one, b'signon shalod, b'skrav, the way he said it, the Chazon Ish, the way he said it, Ramosha, the way he said it, but kulim nisnabu l'nevua achas in their own way. Okay, have a good day.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.